Welcome to the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, where we have open and honest conversations about co-parenting, separation, divorce, and the hardest question of all, should you stay or should you go? I'm Kate Anthony, your divorce survival guide, and I'm here to help you navigate some of the roughest waters you've ever swum in and answer some of your toughest questions. I've been to hell and back, and now it's my mission in life to help you get to the other side of this process with your sanity and your heart intact.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I am welcoming back to the podcast my dear friend and one of your favorite guests, Dr. Marie Cocchiola. And this was sort of an unscripted conversation that we had. We didn't really have a lot of a plan for this conversation. We just knew that we wanted to cover a bunch more topics for the podcast. So we just hit record and went to town. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Marie Cocchiola as much as I enjoy talking to her all the time. And just another quick shameless plug that I have some spots open for Grit and Grace and that I would love to talk to you. You can set up a consultation in the show notes on my website, and it's kateanthony.com. And then you can just click on Grit and Grace in the navigation tab. And you can set up a consultation, and you and I will have a, 20 to 30 minute chat and see if the program is right for you. It is right for so many of you. If you are struggling to decide whether to stay or go, if you are going through a divorce, if you are dealing with domestic violence, if you are dealing with coercive control, if you are in any way struggling through something high conflict and you need support, trust me, there is somebody in the group that is experiencing exactly what you are right now. And the community is such a beautiful thing. So kateanthony.com/coaching, I believe. Just click on the Grit and Grace tab and set up a consultation with me, and we'll make sure that you are a great fit for Grit and Grace. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation with my dear friend, Dr. Marie Cocchiola. Christine, thank you so much for coming back on. And just full disclosure to everyone, we're not 100% sure what we're going to talk about. We've been brainstorming all of the ideas, but we finally just decided to hit record and see where this conversation takes us.
Thank you for having me.
As always, I adore you. Okay, so we are talking about coercive control. Your handle on all the things is coercive control is IPV. And for those who don't know, IPV is intimate partner violence, sometimes called domestic violence, sometimes called domestic abuse. Pick your word. But that's sort of actually part of what we're talking about here, right? Is like everyone has different names for things. And it's kind of important that we get on the same page so that we don't distill our message or confuse people. Right?
Perfect. Mm-hmm.
So coercive control.
So coercive control, the foundation of all types of abuses that occur in intimate relationships. And really, that occur outside of intimate relationships. That's the reality. This could happen at your work. It can happen in microsystems. We call it microsystems. It can happen in intimate relationships. It can happen in mesosystems. That's like in schools, in your workplace, in community agencies, in courts, right? Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Criminal justice system. And certainly it can happen in macro systems. It can happen by governments. This is, seriously, think about governments, that have had rulers in place, right? That have wanted to coercively control people.
Or the entire system of government, or the entire country.
Absolutely. So
we don't shy away from politics on my show, Christine. So don't you worry.
I know. So, I mean, the concept came out of intimate terrorism and what happens to POWs in war and how they would break down and actually give in to their oppressors. So it's this coercion that happens, but it's really often insidious. It's often non-physical, at least initially. And in intimate relationships, what we have to recognize is that even if you don't know you're living in it, it is a type of intimate terrorism because you are stripped of your autonomy. You are so stripped down to nothing without even recognizing it, by the way, which is just always so interesting, right? You don't know what's going on until after you're out. And then when you're out, you're like, shit, that was really effed up.
Yes. That was me. That was me. Wait, what happened?
Right.
Yeah.
So the stripping away of who we are, and and so again, on this micro level in intimate relationships, and we know it happens everywhere, but this idea that I really lose my sense of self. And it's not because, by the way, I have low self-esteem.
No.
It could be, that's the thing about this. We know these perpetrators are actually oftentimes attracted to people who have really great sense of self in work or in family or wherever, because that's an attraction. That's a strength for these people who deep down inside are so weak, so vulnerable, so filled with shame that they need that victim as an object to help them feel good.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say to the listeners, if we could just make it really succinct, most domestic violence, abuse, it doesn't always have to be physically violent. It can be violent, as you always say, in other ways, right? Psychological abuse can certainly feel violent.
Yeah.
Most domestic abuse is based on this power and control.
Right.
When we hear about a victim being hurt or murdered or whatever it is, when someone's murdered, it's based on power and control. That's the reality. And that's most domestic violence. So poo-poo to anybody who says, oh, they were just fighting. That's bullshit. Very few cases are two people or one person who maybe in a moment of rage and perhaps drinking or drugs hit someone and then never does it again. That's situational. That's very, very different than what we're talking about.
Yeah. And that's rare.
Very rare. Because it's what we've used as our lens historically. That's the problem. That's the lens that the family court looks through. That's the lens that criminal court looks through. These are the lenses they use. They say, oh, he did it once. We'll do reform on him. We'll get him help. He'll get therapy. He'll do all these things. He will get better. I call BS. Most of these perpetrators do not get better.
That's right. They escalate. They escalate over time. And I mean, listen, this is a hard conversation to have, but I do want to have it. I want to touch on it. Recently, there have been a lot of murders that have been in the news. Now, I don't think that there are any more murders than there, have been in the past, but at least we're talking about them. And some of these are shocking. Well, they're all shocking, to be honest. And, we were talking about the case in Utah where the father murdered his entire family. How many? There were 6 of them?
6 altogether.
6 altogether? 5 kids and the wife? Or
I thought it was 5 people. Oh, maybe you're right. It was 5 children. It was 5 children, I thought.
Mm-hmm. And the mom.
Mm-hmm.
And in his obituary, they talked about what an amazing dad he was and how he would go to the ends of the earth for his children. Now, this is a man who had a domestic violence call out against him in the past that was probably brushed off the way that you're talking about, right?
Right. And so here's what I think is so important for people to recognize is that people who have this pathology are actors on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And they act the part so well
Yeah.
most of the time, that they even trick, fool those of us so close to them, those of us who should know them so, so well. So imagine if you don't know this person well and you just see them at the soccer game, at the soccer field, or you see them
Right.
at
Yeah.
the
Right.
school,
He's
at a
he's a
school
great
event.
dad.
Oh, he's a great dad. He's a great dad. Well, those children were only fulfilling a need for him because, well, for obvious reasons, he's so very sick, right? And so these are not good parents ever. And the fact that the news actually highlighted that he was a wonderful dad is just really distressing, because the story was really about who was murdered. The story was really about who lost their lives, those innocent children and their mother.
Right. And that's not the story they've been telling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I sort of want to go into a little bit about, as I said, one of my goals, certainly with this podcast, and in my work, is to create an army of activists. I want everyone who listens to this podcast to be so educated about this stuff that they can go out and advocate for themselves in court, that they can advocate for their friends. They can steer their friends in the direction of getting help or understanding and recognizing coercive control. And I don't know. How do we do that? How do we do that when, I say, like, I want them to be able to go into court and, like, tell the judge, but it's not illegal. Coercive control is not illegal, even though it is the foundation of all domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do? Fix it, please, Christine.
We keep talking about it, and we ask people to begin invoking the words coercive control more and more. So I think part of what happens is when something's new, people have an aversion to it. Add in that we are dealing with patriarchal systems.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, oh gosh, here she comes again. She's got this word coercive control. She's going to start lassoing around my courtroom. I mean, I could just hear and I say this, and I want to be clear. Like, I say that there is either ego, meaning bad ego, by the way. I'm not talking about like good. There's either bad, there is bad ego or ignorance when people are not willing to engage in shifts and change. And we see this all the time in our courtrooms. So if we begin to invoke it over and over and over again, there's just going to be a flood of them having to acknowledge that this is truly the shift. We have 5 states now that have codified it as a form of domestic violence. So, I mean, it's just so freaking hard to believe that 2 years ago in the state of Connecticut, if you did not have a physical bruise, then you weren't a domestic violence victim. I mean, that's just so unfathomable.
Well, and that's what it is for 45 states still.
Exactly.
So, right?
Right.
Yes. And so the 5 states, just so we're clear, right, are California, Hawaii, Washington, Colorado, and Connecticut. Those are the 5 states that have codified coercive control, meaning it is defined under the umbrella of domestic violence.
Accurate. Absolutely. Yes. And Massachusetts is working vigorously on this right now. So hopefully they're up next. I'm hopeful that South Carolina is, but I mean, I get, this is like, so how do we create a team of advocates, more than a team of advocates, right? Like an army of advocates.
Army. Mm-hmm.
Right. So this means that for your listeners to reach out to their legislators that they believe might support this kind of legislation and get it's all grassroots. This is grassroots.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so really mobilizing people to push for this legislation to occur. It helps if the person that they seek out is a member on the judicial committee, because if they're on the judicial committee, then judicial members actually get one law to propose, and this could be their law. But if you are, let's just say I'm a legislator and I want this law proposed, but I'm not on the judicial committee, I have to actually try to fight to get it on, like to get it heard. Right. Versus if I'm on the judicial committee, I get one. So, So really important, but these are like, so then that is where we begin to, okay, now we have a law. Now, as Alex Kazar so wisely said, when we passed our law here in Connecticut, you can have a law. It doesn't mean anybody's going to follow it. Then you have to start educating about the law. That means we, again, continually talk about how domestic violence is beyond the physical incident model, how it's coercive control that is the foundation, that this encompasses all of these ways that victims are harmed, including possibly physical, but certainly psychological, gaslighting, intimidation, isolation, manipulation, legal abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, and use of the children as pawns, as weaponizing the children in this process. So when people say, oh, that's high conflict, oh, that drives me freaking crazy, that is not high conflict. That's one person abusing the other person.
That's right. Using the courts. It's right. It's, again, all of these things that you're talking about, right? It's domestic violence by proxy. It's, I'm going to use the court system to abuse you. I'm going to use the children to abuse you. I'm going to use money and control over finances to abuse you. It's all part of the power and control.
Right.
Right. And so, we have talked a little bit, and I think, and now I'm like even more fired up. Every time we talk, I get all fired up. To create like a change.org or a petition, right? That people can more easily sign, and that will go straight to the legislators on the judicial committee, right? If we can identify those players in every state, and we can just create it so that it's simple, we will come back to, I think this is something that I really want to do. And so we'll keep you posted. But I think that would be a really important step, because, we have to make it easy. Like, right. When you tell people, like, figure out who your legislators are who are on the judicial committees, like, it's like, oh,
I get it. Right? I get it. But everyone knows, everyone should know who their state reps are, right? And who their senators are. Reach out to, that's like, for a small state like Connecticut, it's not a lot of people. For California, humongous. But reach out. Senator Rubio is a person. Obviously, that's why California has the law passed. So I get that it's cumbersome. I'm not denying that. But I think that there's that. And then there's also ratifying the ERA so that we actually have equality.
That was my next topic. Because again, every time we talk, we get fired up. And this is so you and I had a conversation last week where we were like, what is the core? How do we get underneath and get to the core of what the problem is? And you, in all your genius and wisdom, were like, it's the ERA. It's ratifying the ERA, because for those who don't know, which you have to know, please, the Equal Rights Amendment, it was brought forth 100 years ago in 1923 to have equal rights for women. And it has yet to be ratified as part of the Constitution, which means that we have no constitutional rights to equality constitutionally as women. And what does that mean, Christine? Why is that such a big deal?
Well, I think when we're treated so unfairly in the judicial system and in the criminal justice system, right? We have women who go to jail for extended periods of time for murdering their oppressors. Yep. You can't make it up, yet someone can. Again, I hate, these are triggering conversations, but a man could sexually abuse a child and not go away for extended periods of time. Yet a woman murders her oppressor and she goes away. It doesn't make any sense. So there's no equality under the law. And just to be really clear, like in the Constitution, it does state, thankfully, people of color, people who are disabled, men. It does not state women. So that's what I hope your listeners hear. Like, whoa, that's like that's how half of the people in the world. Come on.
That's insane. That is insane. And you're right. Like, yes, I mean, absolutely that we have, that we have equality, constitutional equality. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually being played out. But if you are a Black or brown person whose constitutional right to equality is, and safety and all that the Constitution provides is, if they're violated, they can sue.
Yes.
We cannot.
Women cannot sue for a violation of their rights. Yeah. And so there's a woman, I won't mention names, but she's talking about doing a hunger strike in California on the family court steps and in the next coming months. And I mean, I think that's a fabulous idea. Like, how do we draw attention to the inequity in the family court? How is it that over and over again, a woman tells the court that she is a victim of abuse and she loses custody to the abuser? How do we have 50-50 legislation being pushed all across the United States? It's a father's rights agenda. The reality is that good fathers deserve 50-50 and should have 50-50. But if I am an abuser, what is the best way for me to harm you? Oh, are you kidding me? I will take 50-50 and I will go for further. So when a woman suggests that she has been abused or that her children have been abused, and Kate, I'm going to go down a little rabbit hole here, but
Please do.
For years, I worked in Child Protective Services. And I was an educator for the Stranger You Know program. It's a program about child sexual abuse that 93% of offenders to our children are known to the family. Less than 3% are arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. And that's because, think about it, every offender gets to sit across the table from his accuser. Are you going to let a 7-year-old sit across the table? Meaning on a stand across from their abuser? That just doesn't happen. So what happens? These cases get, the charges get diminished. These people don't have to serve as much time. People always say, oh, let me look at the child sex registry list in my area so I know how safe I am. Bullshit. Those are the people who have been arrested. What about the people who have never been arrested, who have never been caught, or the people in the family have said, if you say anything against Uncle so-and-so, we will never talk to you again. So these are all the realities of victims of sexual harm. My point is that if I am a child perpetrator, the ideal person for me to engage in a relationship with is someone who has children or is to have children with someone. So there is this misnomer that people who sexually abuse children are, of course, people who don't have their own children. That's not true. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is that when a woman says, I'm worried about the safety of my children, or I'm not safe, we are not believing them. And so if we could sue, if we could say, that happened, guess what? My child was harmed. That happened. Now I'm taking you to court and I'm suing you. I mean, that's perhaps one small way to make a shift. I don't know. I do know that we need to hold these judges accountable. It's just so effed up.
That is part of the reason that it hasn't been ratified, because these lawmakers in the states in which it hasn't been ratified benefit from it not being law, because because then we can sue the courts. They don't want to get sued.
Right. Because I think that there is, like any court professionals who may be participating in shady work, because we hear about that a lot, right? And I'm not suggesting every GAL, I'm not suggesting that. You do wonder if it's a machine, because how could this be?
Well, it is.
Right. How exactly? Thank you.
I mean, it is.
Right. And so it's a money-making machine, right? There's money to be made. And I was just having this conversation with a colleague of mine who's an expert witness, and she went to court and the judge would not hear her testimony because supposedly it wasn't given early enough, but it was. She was told to come to court. So there was this, we're not going to have that coercive control testimony today. We'll have to continue this for another day. And she said, maybe I should just pack up and be a GAL. And it's like, Where can we make a difference? How? And it goes back to legislation, but also using the legislation, right? It goes back to ratifying the ERA, empowering victims to have a voice.
One of the questions I get asked a lot in my Facebook group, my programs, on Instagram is, what do I do with my engagement ring, my wedding ring? I've got all of these beautiful diamonds. I don't know what to do with them. Well, today's sponsor, Worthy, can help you get the most money possible for your jewelry, fast and risk-free. When you partner with Worthy, they do all the work for you, and their competitive auctions get you up to 3 times what a local jeweler would offer in as little as 2 weeks. The best part about Worthy is that you are in charge of what happens to your jewelry. You set the reserve price, you approve the winning bid, and then you get paid. And if your item doesn't sell for the price that you want, Worthy sends it back to you at no cost, fully insured. And now you can visit worthy.com/DSG and get an extra $100 when your jewelry sells for over $1,500. That's worthy.com/DSG. Worthy, a better way to cash in on that hidden asset in your jewelry box. Worthy.com/DSG.
What can victims do? I mean, I've said, we have to educate ourselves on, even if it's not the law, right? It's like what it should be, what it really is, right? And it's terrible that a victim should have to stand before a judge and try to educate the judge when they're already feeling the way that they are. But how do we, in the face of this, like, how do we work against it? How do we work against the system that is so deeply rigged against us from, like, the roots?
Right. Well, I mean, if we pretend that the system is the abuser, because the system may in fact be the abuser, right? So on top, in other words, it's compound abuse, right? So it's not right. It's not just the primary perpetrator, but it's also the system. If we pretend, let's just pretend, then we strategize differently. So, just like we've learned that with these, like I always say, listen, not all narcissists are coercive controllers, but all coercive controllers are narcissists. And depending on the level of the pathology, they may do something maybe not so harmful, but they may also do very harmful things, right? And again, for your listeners, 99% of victims of domestic violence suffer financial abuse. So that's just a done deal, like just done, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So how do I strategize when I know I'm going into a court where I mean, I have to be around the abuser. Oh my gosh, have a lorazepam. I mean, seriously.
Right.
I have to, maybe I don't have an attorney because my attorney wasn't able to support me in the way, because we do hear about people going pro se and actually doing so very well, right?
Yes, that's right.
So what is that about? That's about figuring out and strategizing. How do I present my case in a way that I don't raise red flags about me? And so, it's an interesting place to be as a clinician, because like I actually end up supporting my clients to not disclose their pain, which is just so sad.
Right.
Like you can't be emotive. You have to be very succinct. And just like, this is what I would say, is just like when we learned how to respond to the narcissist, right? We learned to be very disengaged. I think some people call it yellow rock, right? Yellow rock seems a little too nice for me. Maybe there's something between gray rock and yellow rock, but this idea where you just kind of are very clear and succinct in your answers, and you repeat the same thing. We don't elaborate. Now, as victims, part of the mind games was that we did elaborate, that we did over-explain
over and over again. We have to, because if you could just understand, because you say you love me, but yet you're doing this thing that's hurting me. So if you could just understand, so let me try and explain it a different way, because clearly if you love me, you would want to hear this.
Right. So change that if you loved me and move it to if you would just protect me, because that's what happens in courts is that protective parents will come in and they will try to explain their situation to someone, and not someone who loves them, but someone who's supposed to protect them.
Yep.
And, and the reality is they can't do that. They have to be so succinct, very clear, come up with one or two things to bring forward. And that's it, because these judges don't want to hear anymore. They don't care. I was on a podcast recently here in Connecticut, and it's a judge who runs the podcast, the Lisa Wexler Show. And it's a very small town like podcast, but she clearly stated that judges don't care. They don't want to hear it. They don't care about the details.
Okay. They don't care about the details, but they do care about facts. They also care about facts as they relate to law, right? Which is where we have a problem to begin with. Right. So what you're saying is they don't care about the details. They don't want to hear. And I do this with my clients all the time, where they're like, but he said this or he did this. And I'm like, nobody's going to care about that. Correct. Nobody's going to, like, I know that feels egregious to you, but that's not illegal. That doesn't violate any laws. He's an asshole. You're not going to litigate assholery. But what are we going to, like, what is he doing what are the laws that are being violated here? Or what is, really, that's all they care about. And someone said this to me on a podcast episode a couple of years ago, I think, that the other thing is that not only how does it relate to the law, but how does this impact custody or maintenance? Because those are the things that judges are like, they're basically there to rule on custody and spousal or child support, right? That's basically it. So if the abuse is something that relates to those two things, then like, okay, right? And I think as you're saying, as unemotionally as possible, which really gets us into a bit of a double bind, right? Because, if we're not emotional, Amber Heard, then we're cold and unlikable, right? But if we're emotional, then we're off the hook. We're hysterical.
Right. Exactly. And I think you just hit on something else that's important to bring up. And that is, so the strategy is not as emotional as maybe we're feeling, even though you have every right to feel those emotions and you should be very upset. But the strategy is to retain that for therapy or loved ones and not in the courtroom, right?
Right.
No matter what's going on, because the moment that you do actually express that I always say that the abuser can do 10 wrong things, but when the victim does one wrong thing, that's what everybody remembers, and that's what the judge will hold on to. That's the sad part. Again, that's inequality. Yep. That's why we need to have, the ERA passed, right? But I think it's important to think about, we don't go in to the courtroom with exactly what we want. We go into the courtroom with what we think the abuser thinks we want. This is how we strategize.
Okay. Say more about that. Right. So, okay. Say more about that.
So it's so important to think like the abuser. So I know this is not an easy, this is not an easy thing to even reconcile in our heads, but is the abuser really interested in not paying you child support? Is that really what's going on? And so if you know that and you don't need the child support, maybe you really do, but you can figure out a way around the child support, would that change the outcome of custody? Because is he only holding on to custody because he doesn't want to have to pay you child support? So it's about finding a workaround to what he's looking for. I'll give you a little quick example. So I knew exactly what I wanted out of my house, but I knew that if I asked for what I wanted, I would get none of it.
Mm.
So I wrote a list of what I didn't want in hopes that maybe I would get some of what I wanted, right? That's the strategy around the narcissist, right? The attempt is to control at all costs.
Mhm.
So how do I make him think? And in the case of the family court, how do I make the judge think they are honored? I mean, it's sorry, we are stroking that ego, good or bad, whether they have a good ego or a bad ego. How do I make it seem that I am going to give you, you do have control, and that I, as the victim, I don't have any control, and I'm fine with that. I'm not going to be upset about that. The reality is, behind the scenes, I've got all the control because I'm playing them like puppets. So
Right.
we need victims and survivors, and this is so hard when you are suffering complex post-traumatic stress, betrayal trauma, you have compound trauma. There is so much pain. But if you could find somewhere deep inside of you this strength to be 2 steps ahead of what that abuser wants, and be ready to give them what they think they want, and in the meantime, you get what you want.
So smart. It's so smart. And it requires having an attorney who understands all of these machinations. Right. And I think it also requires having someone like you or me or somebody who knows, who can help with that strategy.
And maybe it's not an attorney. Sometimes these attorneys are useless, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And so in those cases, is it just you? Which again, you need an army of support to be able to do that, though, for sure.
That's right. That's right. And I think, going pro se is far more, I think it's like more recommended now for victims because attorneys don't have the training. If you can't find someone in your area who really has the training or is willing to get the training, I have a client who was in a absolutely horrendous, she's probably still in it. It'll be 10 years at least. He'll drag it out forever. He's a psychopath. But her attorneys started taking classes in this stuff so they could better understand how to support her, because they were like, whoa, this is definitely outside of our area of expertise, but we want to get this right.
That's amazing. That is
great.
Such a great story. I love that. And,
yes.
And so, the point is that they do need to be educated. Sometimes they're unwilling to be educated because, again, we're talking about patriarchal norms, right? Where people really don't see or believe victims and survivors. But I also think it's important, so I think oftentimes what I've seen with people who are hiring attorneys is they have an expectation that the attorney is going to do the job and do it right. And the reality is that's not true. Every attorney has about 50 more cases than they should on their caseload. Every single attorney. They open your file 10 minutes before they get on a call with you. That's when they open it up. They don't know the details of your case. The best cases, and I have a client just recently who sadly lost her case, but she did all of the work and she still lost. But the point is that the only way that her attorney would have been even able to represent her in the correct way was if the client had actually spoon-fed her every single aspect of the court case. So don't expect your attorney to know what to do.
Yep.
I always have to remind my clients, your attorney works for you.
I say it all the time. They work for you. Fire your attorney. If they're not working for you, fire them. Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes if you go with the big firm with the fancy name, sometimes they might have a little bit more of a machine behind them to support you. But it was a small boutique firm that my client was with, who was genuinely cared about her and genuinely wanted to expand their knowledge to be able to support her. So it's not always the best to go with the biggest, fanciest law firm.
No.
But do your due diligence, right? Like interview people and ask them, what is your experience with this? And going up against a system where it's not part of the system.
Sure. And I think it's important to point out that sometimes it's when the divorce proceedings start, that the light bulb goes off for victims. Oftentimes, you hire an attorney, you think, you just want a fair attorney, a decent attorney. You're not thinking, oh, I need someone who specializes in domestic violence or narcissism. You're not thinking like that until you're in the middle of it and you're realizing, oh my gosh, there's something really wrong here. And by the way, my attorney doesn't get it, which is really very stressful and overwhelming.
Yes, it is. And because very often you'll have abusers who are compliant and everything's fine and we're going to be amicable and let's mediate, right? So that they can try and control it. And then they drop the bombs on you. Then their control starts to come out even more.
Right. So I think that that's an important, that's key, is to, attorneys need to understand that there is a huge difference between victims and perpetrators. And it's not that hard to figure out once you've got your little antenna up. I mean, come on, how hard is this? I mean, a victim is going to be really upset and sad about the losses that are occurring. Authentically so. We should be attuned to other people and be able to figure out if that's real or not, or are they on stage? Right. And victims are not going to be looking for revenge. They may want what's fairly theirs, but they're not going to be looking for revenge. And so when we all of a sudden, you're going to court and then all of a sudden the perpetrator's like, oh yeah, no, I think I want 50-50 now. Like, really, where's that coming from? Is this the father? Is this the father who brought the children to every single activity when they were little and all the nurses, all the doctor's appointments and all the school events? Or was this the father who showed up periodically because he was busy working? What father are we talking about? Because if this father has not historically been engaged in his children's welfare, then why are we to assume that right now this is authentic? Let's question that for a moment, please. Come on. Oh my God.
Okay. So, 50-50 is the norm, right? 50-50 equal shared parenting, whatever you want to call it, right? That is what courts prefer, but it's not what most children, if we also look at what are the children used to, especially with a stay-at-home mom, why 50-50? Father's rights.
Yeah.
Father's rights movement. Yeah.
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 So anytime a guy shows up to be a good dad, we have the freaking Macy's parade coming down the street. I mean, that's the reality because, but when a mom shows up to do that, that's the norm. We just kind of,
that's right.
So
that's right.
Right. When guys do the right thing, it's celebrated. It's like, oh my God, he's such a good dad. When women do the right thing, it's expected. And that's.
Yeah. And what's really frustrating about 50-50 too, and, equal shared parenting is that the parenting time may be equal, but the parenting is not. We're still doing all the work. We're still making all the appointments and the doctor's appointments and taking them to the appointments. And we're still, even those of us who run our own businesses, who work just as much, work full time, right? We are still managing all of it all the time.
Yeah. And we don't, so we call it it's called the double day in sociology. And this idea that women, historically, when women started going back to work, right, it was they had a double day and
it's the second shift.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
But and here's the thing. I mean, you're expressing that and I hear you, but we don't even mind, by the way. We want to be that person in our children's lives. We love that, I mean, it'd be great to have a little help sometimes, sure. But
right. Well, and I think it's the expectation that we'll just do it. Right. I mean, there are plenty of things that, listen, if my ex was like, oh, you know what, don't worry about it, I got this. Do you need or, not even do I need, because that's assuming I'm the owner of it. Right. But, hey, I made an appointment for the dentist, or, hey, Emmett's got, this going on that I'd be so thrilled. I'd be fucking thrilled. Right. And just to be clear, the double shift and the double day that you're talking about, the second shift refers to the fact that working women they'll go to work all day and then come home and work all night, like a second shift, because they're responsible for all of the domestic labor, right? When men will come home and they'll be like, whew, I worked hard and I got to, put my feet up and not do anything. And then we've also worked hard, but we're also the ones primarily responsible for shopping, for cooking, for cleaning, for giving the kids the baths, for doing homework, all of that.
Right. And I think thankfully that's shifting a little bit, but the other side to that is that even moms who stay home, that there is this belief that they're not working and
what do you do all day?
And it's like, oh my gosh, what I would do to go to work on some of those days, right?
Absolutely.
So just a lack of appreciation and a lack of, it's inequality. That's what it really comes down to.
It's back to the ERA, folks. It's back to, and I think that the ERA it's literal, it's legal, it impacts civil law, all of those things. It's also really symbolic, right? Because we know we live in a patriarchy, right? We always talk about we live in a patriarchy. It's a constitutional patriarchy. It's down to the Constitution. And if it were in the Constitution that we were actually equal under the law, there would be a different expectation. It would seep into the culture differently, I believe. One would hope. It would give us leverage, if nothing else. And that's just, we need women to have the ability to fight for their rights to have their children. I mean, their rights to be protected from domestic violence. I mean, there's no words. It's so unbelievable. And, and the fact that that there's not a huge, and I'm grateful for all of the men and non-binary individuals who are taking up this torch. I am so grateful for that, but I just don't understand how it's not a huge, huge movement. What else would we need to make it a huge movement? Well, you and I are going to work on that.
Kate Anthony.
Listen, I'm getting fired up about this now. I'm talking to all the ERA people about this now because I'm like, wait,
Yay!
what?
Yay.
Wait, what? They're going to be on the podcast. I really think, 2023, first of all, because it's the 100th anniversary
of not being signed.
of not being signed. I mean, it's coming, y'all. I'm going to be talking about this a lot more because give me a fucking break. Dr. C, my dear friend, thank you so much for having this conversation. And as always, where can people find you so they can follow along the really important work that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, Dr. Cocchiola, Coercive Control, and also on Twitter, Coercive Control. And I have a website they can check out if they'd like to. So, yeah.
And what's the website?
It's Coercive Control Consulting.
All things coercive control.
Trying to stop it.
Thanks, love. Thank you so much for coming on and just spitballing a fired up conversation with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the great things you do. You're amazing.
I adore you. You are amazing.
You're an advocate on rollerblades, I think. Yeah, I see you in California on the rollerblades. Yeah.
It's not true, y'all. I fall flat on my face. But I love that you see that in your mind's eye.
I
do. Hilarious. Oh my God. Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. If you like what you hear, head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in and leave me a review. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at The Divorce Survival Guide. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, you, my love, deserve to be happy.